This is truly the scariest, most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. I have never been so petrified in my life. I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting university. Our home was just outside of a small town which was surrounded by thick forests. There was also a small man-made lake, which diverged from a river that ran for miles through the forest and split into a few streams just east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forest well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. I knew all the shortcuts. The walk I would go on always led me deep into the forest. I'd follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone or with my dad over the span of 18 years, and I never ever saw anybody else in the forest. I went there twice that summer. The first time, I left in the morning. I walked along the path away from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands in the water, I heard a bell ring. It sounded distant and seemed to be coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring fervently and periodically, which I found strange. I listened well and wondered, what if it was a lost hunting dog? This made me move towards the sound, which in hindsight was extremely stupid. I realized it couldn't have been an animal. I could tell the bell was too heavy to be on a collar because of how clear the sound was. I kept moving, and the bell was moving away from me. After about 5 minutes, it stopped completely. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell that could have been enclosed in a tin, and the river was too far still. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound, apart from the obvious, which I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to have been a person, but this thought alone was far too terrifying. I decided to stop thinking about it and just walked on normally. I admired the familiar forest, the leaves on the ground and soft sounds of the stream, until something caught my eye. A badger had been carefully decapitated and placed in the middle of the path. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh, but the wound was already infested by maggots. The body was still limp, but there wasn't too much smell coming from it. I knew whatever had killed this animal must have done so within the last hour. Then it dawned on me. The sound of the bell had been following the stream, just like I was. This meant that the badger must have been killed as I followed the sound. I turned and ran back. I did not want to encounter whatever sick person mutilated this animal. A week later, I went back for the second time that summer, and that was the last time I ever set foot in that forest. I left home at around 6 p.m. My familiarity with the forest gave me a false sense of safety despite sunset being so close. I made it to the same stream, then walked to the same river in an hour, then decided to go back the way I came because it was getting late and it began to rain quite heavily. The sun set at around 9 p.m. and I walked as fast as I could. The sound of the rain hitting the trees was the loudest I'd ever heard it. I kept my head down and was careful with my steps. The rain made the ground very muddy and I didn't want to slip. Then it happened. Something hit my head. A foul, pungent smell filled the air as I looked up. It was the decomposing body of the same badger from the previous week. It had been strung up by its paws on a low-lying branch. This time its head had been strung up with it. The most putrid stench came from the green liquid which oozed from the corpse. I gagged. I knew this fluid was all over my coat. It was in my hair and I began to gag. At first I just stared at it, slightly gobsmacked. Then I started fidgeting violently because I felt like I was drenched in that green liquid. I was soaking from the rain and my senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river. Someone had strung up the body up after I'd passed the tree on the way to the river. Someone knew I'd see it when I walked back. Someone was watching me. Were the faint sounds of branches breaking around not animals? Was I so immersed in the sound of the rain that I missed the footsteps of someone stalking me? I looked around and started to jog. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back towards the path, and then I heard it again. The bell was ringing, but this time it was coming towards me. My heart began to race, and I proceeded to call my dad as I ran back. Luckily, he answered almost instantly, and I tried to explain what was happening. I told him about the badger, and I told him I was being stalked. He could also hear the bell, so I knew it was real, which somehow made it so much worse. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west. It was the closest part of the path that I knew he could get to quickly. I can't explain the feeling I had. I was running on pure adrenaline at this point. I was exhausted, but I knew if I slowed down, even for a few seconds, whoever was behind me would catch up. It was completely dark at this point, and I was panicking because the path was still too far away for me to feel safe. It was still pouring down with rain, and every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for longer than the last time, on and off. I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I could barely see made me slightly lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I was running on autopilot at that point. I was breathing like a goddamn horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs. I stayed on the phone with my parents throughout the run back. I think their voices were the only thing keeping me sane at that point. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mom was screaming on the phone at the same time that they were on the path, that I needed to run faster, that my dad had gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified and I went into survival mode. I began to half walk, half run as exhaustion crept over my body. Then I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and the bell was ringing louder. I didn't want to, but I looked over my shoulder. For the first time, I saw what had been in the forest with me. A tall, thin figure was creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. He didn't look human. His build was so unnatural, and I knew my fate would be the same as that badger if I allowed him to catch me. I screamed as much as I could. I lied and shouted, "I'm on the phone with the police, they're on the path. Dad, I can see you, I'm here." A sudden burst of adrenaline made me run faster than I had even run before. I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck, and then I switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and had only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. Things no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell continuously ringing. I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way. I cried even harder and ran towards the sound of his voice. I pretty much lunged myself at him when we got to each other. My dad heard the bell too and saw the figure lurking a few meters behind. We both ran towards the car and drove back so fast. At this point, both my parents were crying with me. My mom kept repeating, "I heard it, I heard the bell," as if the realization that it was real had just hit her. We vowed to never step foot in the forest again. As the years went on, I was tempted to go back, just to satisfy my curiosity. But the image of the man, the badger, the bells, I couldn't tempt fate again.
Watch another if you dare.